All right, welcome everybody to this November 7th special board meeting. I'd like to call to order. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve the agenda is presented.
Second.
All right. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right. Linda is not able to join us today because I believe she's got a work event, and Brian may be teaching class, but he might pop on later. So I guess we're here to do the presentation about the bond information. So Chris, if you want to go ahead.
I'm going to actually jump in first just to remind
Oh,
community
yeah,
how we got here. And so thankful for the feedback that we got from the board's community roundtable that was held in September. And a lot of the feedback as presented to the board as next steps, community asking for a comparative analysis of varying ways to generate revenue and looking at what the impact potentially could be on community. From those conversations and the feedback received, a few of the items that actually surfaced were what would be the impact of a potential tax levy, what would be the impact of a bond, and any other measures that we could use to generate revenue. As a part of the new focus on equity and ensuring that those are included in all of our board agendas, want to remind community of those questions and items. So for this particular board agenda item, this item supports and benefits our students, staff, board, administration, and community as it ensures that we are all informed and making effective decisions based on the information that is received, and also ensuring that it aligns to board policy as a means to increase outcomes for students and staff. This particular presentation does not impact differentially any of our community members or groups. However, it does allow the board to support underrepresented or marginalized students based on their diverse needs, because the additional funding would be able to support those groups and the outcomes associated with it. And lastly, what's included to eliminate disparities. This professional learning is required under MSIP 6 as it's a focus around governance practices, as well as ensuring the board is making equitable decisions. Tonight, we will have a joint presentation from Lorenzo Boyd from Stiefel, in addition to Chris Hoser, CFO. So I will now hand it off to Lorenzo Boyd to begin our presentation.
Thanks, Dr. Jameson. Can everyone hear me? Great, Chris. Thanks for having me, Dr. Jameson. And Chris, thanks for having me as well. I wanted to go through a brief presentation. I think I only have about 3 hours to present this information. So I'll be short and quick. I hope you guys can bear with me. The first page that you'll go through, Chris, are you able to, do I have control of the screen? Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you. So the first page, I wanted to go through the Maplewood Richmond High School District, their outstanding general obligation bonds at this point. So as you can see on this first page, this is what I call the debt profile for the school district. So right now, the school district currently has general obligation bonds outstanding, as well as one lease obligation outstanding. So I'll go through each one of those financings individually, and you'll see the original par amount, the principal outstanding, and the call dates and their call price. So the first issue that you have outstanding is what we call the taxable qualified school construction bonds. We call those Q-Scoobies. Those were issued back in 2010 through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Those were originally issued for $3,370,000. There's $3,370,000 outstanding. Those bonds are non-callable, meaning those bonds cannot be called for savings because those are subsidized bonds by the federal government. So much of their interest is paid by the federal government. I think twice a year, Chris has to submit a form to the federal government to get that interest subsidized twice a year, every 6 months. Once in the payments are made every March and September. I think that paperwork has to be submitted to the federal government by February. So Chris has been doing that for the past several years just to get that interest subsidized. So those bonds essentially, since they're essentially no interest being paid for the school district, essentially those are almost zero interest-free bonds. So those would be non-callable because there'll be no real obligation or real priority to actually refinance those bonds because they're essentially interest-free. So then you have your 2015 bonds. Those were new money bonds as well. Those were issued back in July of 2015. Those were issued in the original principal amount of $6,100,000. You'll see there that there's right now $2,635,000 remaining. Those bonds have a call date of March 1st, 2023. The reason why those bonds have not been called for savings, generally speaking, what you'll see some of your other bonds in 2016 and 2019, which were refunding obligations of different series of bonds. The 2015 bonds, we've actually looked at refinancing those bonds for savings, but the current rate on those bonds are essentially lower than current interest rates in the current market. We will continue to look at those and monitor those for savings. I think the last time we looked at actually refinancing those bonds or sent an update to the school district was about 3 months ago. And at that point, the current interest rate on those bonds were lower than the current market, as you are probably aware. Over the past, I would say going back to 2023, and actually a little bit before that, in 2022, interest rates rose significantly. But including today, there was a 25 basis point reduction in the Fed funds rate, which would actually decrease interest rates on bonds as well. And the previous rate reduction from the federal government was 50 basis points. So we're looking to dust those off probably within the next week or so to let the market catch up to itself and see if there's a possibility to refinance those bonds for savings. And then we have the 2016 bonds. Those were general obligation refunding bonds. So those bonds were actually used to refinance for savings previous bonds that were issued. So those were issued in the original principal amount of $8,120,000. There's $4,750,000 remaining. Like the previous bonds, 2015, those have a call date of 3/1/2024. So those are eligible to be refinanced right now for savings, but right now current rates are not in favor of refinancing those bonds for savings. So we'll keep monitoring those as well. The next series of bonds are your 2019 bonds. Those were also refunding bonds. Those were issued in the original principal amount of $3,155,000. There's $3,155,000 remaining. Those have a call date of 3/1/2027. By the new rule that was implemented 6 years ago, we cannot actually refinance those bonds until within 90 days of their call date. So the first opportunity that we'll be able to refinance those bonds for savings will be December of 2026. And the same goes true for the actual 2020 bonds, which were for two purposes. Those were a new money issue and a refunding issue. Those were issued in an amount of $28,530,000. There's currently $27,625,000 remaining. Those also have a call date of March 1st, 2027. So the first chance that we'll actually be able to refinance those bonds for savings on a tax-exempt basis would be December of 2026. And then your last set of debt your last set of debt, which actually is different than the general obligation bonds. Your general obligation bonds are paid from your Fund 3, your debt service fund. The school district does have a lease purchase agreement outstanding that was dated back in February of 2023 for $3 million. There's currently $2,855,000 remaining. That has a call date of 4/1/2027. So the first opportunity that we will be able to refinance those for savings would be January of 2027. Remember, within 90 days of its call date. And I'll pause there to see if there are any questions before I go to the next page.
I just had a question. Maybe this is for you, Dr. Jameson. What is the lease purchase agreement for? Is that a building?
That was actually,
I
sorry,
can
Lou-
grab that one if you want, Dr. J.
yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
We used that to purchase the Maria J. Langston Administrative
Okay.
Center
Okay.
and to renovate it, and also to pick up any of the slack left on the big project over there at the middle school, high school.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I was just going to pull that up. Any other questions? Thanks, Jenny. Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. The next page is your debt capacity. In the state of Missouri, school districts can issue general obligation bonds up to 15% of their assessed valuation. So with the most recent assessed valuation currently, the school district has an assessed valuation for the entire district of $457,153,490. Based on the 15% limit, the school district could issue up to 68.5 million in general obligation bonds. Currently, there's 38,220,000 remaining. That will be as of April of 2025. So that leaves you with a legal debt capacity of 30,353,000 in terms of what you can issue in bonds up to your legal debt limit. School districts have 15%. Fire districts can issue debt up to 5% of their assessed valuation, and cities can issue up to 20% of their assessed valuation for general obligation bonds. So right now, you have about 30 million that you could issue up to your legal debt limit. Chris, next page. Were there any questions there? Okay. So here's what we are looking at in terms of projected bonding capacity. So what I really wanted to do here is put together a nice Excel spreadsheet. As you can see, the one thing that you'll see, it's very conservative. I'm not showing any assessed valuation growth. You'll see that assessed valuation is pretty constant from 2025 through 2040. Obviously, we know that assessed valuation is going to grow, but this is just a conservative estimate in terms of showing you at your current assessed valuation based on your bonding capacity at the 15% and the total debt that you have outstanding, what your capacity would be each year as you start to pay off debt. So you'll see there in 2025, as we kind of mentioned on the previous page, a little over 68.5 million in bonding capacity. End of debt for that current year would be 38.2 million. Your available capacity would be 30.3 million. In the state of Missouri, what you can use to increase your capacity are the funds on hand in your debt service fund. So what that's showing you is your fund balance at the end of each calendar year. So taking into account your available capacity of 30.3 million with your fund balance that you have, your capacity is right around 34.4 million. And you'll see how that grows each year as you start to pay off your outstanding obligations. And if you pay attention to the total end of your debt, you'll see and we'll show there in terms of that column, I believe it's the fifth one from the left, how each year your debt is going down roughly about $3 to $4 million each year. Any questions so far? Okay. This is what we call a debt map. So this kind of shows you on the two previous pages, I'm sorry, on the first page, what you saw was just an overview of all of your debt. This is showing you basically the same overview, but it's showing you for each individual issue how much you're paying off each year. This is just principal, and it shows you the respective interest rates for each series of bonds. So you'll see there the qualified school construction bonds. Those are the bonds that, if you recall, were essentially the 5.78 in terms 5 7/8, what you're paying in terms of interest that's being subsidized by the federal government. You're paying off $900,000 next year, in March of 2025, and then you're going to pay off 1,230,000 in 2026, and the final maturity will represent 1,240,000. So essentially, you have about 2 years and 3 months remaining before that issue is paid off. Then you have your 2015 bonds. If you recall, those were new money bonds. You'll see the respective, amounts that you're going to pay off each year for each maturity, their respective interest rates. That item that's highlighted, what you'll see, that 715,000 and 1,285,000. On March 1st of 2024, the district used funds on hand in the actual debt service fund to prepay those particular maturities. So what's remaining for the 2029 maturity is the 510,000 that you see to the right of the two highlighted columns. Oh, one thing I do want to add, if you see at the bottom, the district currently has a AA minus underlying rating. Whenever the district does go into the municipal market, think of that underlying rating like an individual credit score. So if the higher that credit rating, the better interest rates that you could receive in the municipal market. The lower that credit rating, obviously, the higher interest rates you're going to receive when we go to sell those bonds. It's almost like an individual credit score. So if I was to go into a bank and had a 700 credit score, I could possibly get an interest rate of 7% on a new loan for a new house. But if Chris was to go into that same bank and had a 600 credit score, he may pay 8.5%. So Chris, I'm not saying you have a lower credit score than me, but that's just an example only. And your 2016 bonds, as you can see at the top, those bonds were a refunding or a refinancing opportunity. And you'll see at the bottom that back in 2016, Stifel used that opportunity to refinance those bonds for savings. So we actually refinanced the Series 2007 bonds for savings. And right now, you only have 3 maturities remaining. That's your 1,515,000 all the way to 1,635,000. So that issue will be completely paid off in two years and 2 months. And as I mentioned on the first page, you'll see the call dates and the underlying rating there, as well as AA minus. Next page. And here's a summary of the remaining 3 issues for the school district. So you have your 2019 bonds. Again, you see the rating there. Those bonds actually will start maturing in 2028, and their final maturity will be in 2030. You'll see there as well, those 2019 bonds were used to refinance for savings your Series 2010 B bonds. So those, as I mentioned on the previous page, would have a call date of March 1st, 2027. And then you have your 2020 A bonds. You'll see they have maturities ranging from 2025 through 2040. So those bonds will be outstanding for another 15 years. There's roughly 27.6 million remaining. Those bonds were a combination of new money and refinancing. So a portion of those proceeds were used to actually refinance the 2011 lease and also the 2010 general obligation bonds, in addition to the new money. Then you have your 2023 lease obligations. So as you can see there, those are the amounts that you're paying off each year from 2025 through 2037 with a 3.99 interest rate. Those bonds, the lease purchase agreement was a direct placement with a local bank. With a bank. And those are currently callable in January of 2027. So that would be the first opportunity that we could refinance those bonds, because that will be within the 90 days of its call date of April 1st, 2027. Any questions so far?
Yeah, sorry, I have a question. This is Brian Matz.
Hey, Brian.
Thanks so much so far for your presentation. What of those 2020 general obligation bonds, how much of that was used to refinance the 2010?
Okay, I can look that up. I have my computer right here. If you're just going to bear with me for a second, I can pull those numbers up. Is it okay?
Yep, that's fine. If you need to do that later and we can talk about it after you're finished, that's fine.
That's pretty quick. Let's see, deals. Those were the 2020 A's. Is that correct?
Yes.
Numbers. Let's
And
see
you-
here. Okay, numbers are coming up right now, Brian. So the refunding portion of that particular series of bonds was actually pretty low. So I'll give you the actual amounts that were for each issue. So there was a refunding piece and a new money piece. And so I'm just kind of running through the numbers right now. So the total amount of the actual refunding was $2,010,000.
Okay.
And the portion of that was attributable to the actual refunding. I'll give you those amounts right now. Your 2017 comps were 1,790,000.
Okay.
And then the rest was for the actual 2010 A's.
Got
Yep.
it. Okay. So a little less than $1 million. Okay.
Yep. Yes.
And then the 2019, was most of that for refinancing, or
It
was
was all
that-
for it was all for
that
refinancing.
was all and that was all for the 2010? You said earlier 2010. So
Yeah, 2010 B's, right.
okay. Sorry, and then just one last question. I wasn't living in the district in 2010. Maybe somebody here might know what were those 2010 bonds issued for?
I can put up the OS for you. I should have that. Chris, not unless you know right off the top of your head. Let's see. 2010.
I mean, I do. It's a little foggy. It was like almost 15 years ago now. I believe we did exterior windows at the ECC.
I'm pulling up the final OS right now, Brian.
Okay.
I don't have the ballot language handy, but I can read
No,
you
that's-
from the actual.
We'll get you that, Brian.
Yeah, that's fine.
I can go back. I got to go back through my records and take a look. I don't want to misspeak.
Yeah. Well, if he has it there in the bond issue statement, that'd be fine.
Oh, it's pretty generic, but it says here the 2010 B's and C's were used to pay the cost of acquiring, constructing, renovating, expanding, improving, furnishing, and equipping school sites. Then it goes to the
okay.
plan of financing.
Just whatever we wanted to do.
Yeah.
There
Okay.
were specific projects attached to that, Brian.
I'm sure. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll get
At
to
some
that.
point down the road, I'd like to know what projects were completed with that we're now paying off.
Let's see here. Yeah, it's pretty. I was looking through the actual official statement, Brian. But it's pretty. It was $9 million or so that was used just for general construction, renovating. But I may probably, Chris, if you don't have it, I can probably go through some of the documents in the deal file to show what those specific projects are. So I can give that to you. So we can I'll probably be able to do that whenever we get off this call and see what those projects were.
No rush. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And I just had a quick question. So, I assume, I'm hoping a AA- bond rating is a good rating. Where does that sort of fall in the bond rating terms?
That's a great rating, actually.
Okay.
So the way the ratings work with Standard & Poor's, there's investment grade. And so the highest rating that you can have from Standard & Poor's is an actual AAA.
Okay.
And then it goes from AAA to AA plus
Okay.
to AA to AA minus. Right now, I think there are a little over 520 school districts in the state of Missouri. There are currently only 170 of those school districts actually have an underlying rating, which is very important to kind of get you the best price in the marketplace. that double A minus is probably within the top 25% of all those school districts, just to give you
Great.
some perspective.
Yes, thank you.
Mhm. Okay, your debt service levy. So this is just your fund 3, and going from left to right, as you recall, I'm sorry, on the previous page where I was pretty conservative in showing no assessed valuation growth. This is pretty much keeping that constant as well. Going from left to right, this is a spreadsheet I think I created probably about 25 years ago. It shows your levy year 2025, and that's just because the reason why those two numbers are different, or those 2 years are different, the district sets its levy by October 1st in one calendar year, and that levy that it sets in October of that calendar year is used to pay the debt service for the next calendar year. So that's why you have the levy year and the debt year. Then you have your AV, which is short for your assessed valuation. If we go to the bottom of that page, you'll see there I'm really being conservative, but your average 5-year growth, and that's really slanted by 2 years in 2021, you received over 7% growth, and then in 2023, over 17% growth. So you've had about almost 7% if you look at a 5-year average in terms of your assessed valuation growth, but that's really kind of thrown out by those 2 years that you had 17% one year and 7% in the other year. Your current debt service levy is $1.35. The tax revenue, that's in terms of the collections, that includes delinquent and current taxes. I'm using a 5-year average there as well. I think using a 5-year average is probably the best defensible mechanism when you're looking at collecting taxes. And as you can see, in 2023, you had over 102%. And some people may say, how can you get over 100%? Well, you have delinquencies there as well. So as you can see, the same year that in 2020, you had over 100% as well. So that 5-year average of all the previous 5 years was 99.5%. So I'm using that. The next column is what we call state assessed railroad and utility. I'm using a 5-year average there. You'll see last year, Chris actually placed 124,000 into your fund 3. Essentially, you were hovering right around in 2020 and 2021, right around 113,000. You had about 117,000 in 22 and 23, and that amount went up in 2024. So that gives you a total revenue of a little over 6.2 million. Your debt service right now is right around 4.5 million. So that required levy. So that's where we're going into the following pages. Your required levy is right around 97 cents. So you're going to add potentially $1.7 million into your debt service fund this next year, which would take you over 100%. The reason why we've prepaid bonds in the past, because you'll see that column to the far right, in terms of, I think that's in 2025, where you get to be 129%. You'll need to do either one of 3 things when you're looking at that column specifically. You'll either need to do a new bond issue, you have to lower your levy, or you have to do a defeasance, which we've done for the school district, and prepay some bonds. So any questions thus far? Okay. Brian?
It gets, if you get over 100%, you reach that. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes, exactly right. So, and I would say, Brian, probably you've seen this probably, especially with your, I would say, mid-county and North County issuers, not just school districts, but fire districts. I work with fire districts, Brian, and cities as well. What you've seen is this assessed valuation growth that has been very large in the last 5 years, and in particular those reassessment years. I live in the Hazelwood School District, and we've seen in those 2 years where you've had 17%, we've had 25% growth. So that puts a lot of money, extra money, into your debt service fund. So a lot of school districts and cities and fire districts had to use some of those excess monies to actually pay down some of their outstanding balance, some of their outstanding debt. I'm sorry.
Right. Or you can refund it to the taxpayers, you said.
Yeah,
You can lower
exactly.
the, okay.
Lower the tax rate. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And then the other thing is why, but I guess I'm wondering, why do you keep the assessed value in column 3 the same for all these years? Why not build in assumptions of increases in assessed value? Are we just not allowed to make assumptions? We have to go with what the county gives us and stick
Yeah,
with that number only?
Yeah, we're allowed to put in assumptions. I can change that to 1%, 1.5%, 2%. That was done historically in consultation with the district in terms of just being conservative to make sure.
Because that would lower the percentage on the far right column, right?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Okay.
So this is just being ultra conservative, which is always put you in a great position. And that's why, one of the things in terms of that AA minus, that's a great rating for you guys, but it's because the district has always been prudent in terms of and had a conservative nature in terms of both on the operating side and the debt side.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. The next page is showing a potential bond issue in 2025. What we're saying there is a 15 million bond issue. This is assuming that the school district went from the $1.35 in its debt service fund to 85 cents. So transferring 50 cents to the actual operating fund from the debt service fund, and then keeping your tax rate at 85 cents in Fund 3. So basically that stream of revenue, what that could get you and what you could obtain based on lowering your debts, lowering your debt service levy to 85 cents, the district could issue $15 million in bonds. What you'll see there, I wouldn't be alarmed by that red column that you see to the far right in the use of fund balance column. The school district is allowed to have a reasonable reserve, and right now you're just drawing down that reserve slightly so that you don't get above that 100%. You'll see that's pretty common when you're looking at new issues, but we want to maximize the money that's available to the school district on the operating side. So basically taking it down to where we're not going below 50%. You're not allowed to go, I'm sorry, once you get above 100%, you have to do those 3 options that I mentioned before. But really what I wanted to do to the far right is kind of break into where the school district did not lower its lower its fund balance below 50%, because we know that Standard & Poor's looks at that reserve. So I want to make sure that we were healthy there so that it didn't have an adverse effect on the school district's municipal debt rating. So that's taking 50 cents from your debt service fund, which is Fund 3, transferring that has to be done via an election to the operating side, and then lowering that to 85 cents, the school district could still issue up to $15 million of general obligation bonds and no tax rate increase. And obviously, if we built in assumptions to that, just kind of using what you were talking about, Brian, if we were looking at 1% or 1.5% growth, that number that's in the use of fund balance column would go down in terms of you would decrease the amount that you're drawing in the fund balance.
Right.
So any questions thus far?
Lorenzo, can you remind community, I know we talk about like Fund 3 being debt service. Can you remind community and the board what the other funds are and what they're used for?
Yeah. So the school district, school districts in the state of Missouri have 4 funds that they utilize. Fund 1 would be your general fund. Fund 2 would be your teachers fund. Fund 3 would be your debt service fund. Your debt service fund can only be used to pay general obligation bonds. It cannot be used to pay lease debt. It cannot be used for salaries. It cannot be used for improvements throughout the school district. So once that levy is in place, that debt service levy that's in place for Fund 3, that can only be used to pay your principal and interest on your outstanding general obligation bonds and any fees that you receive in terms of maintenance for the payment of those bonds. And then you have your Fund 4, which is called your Capital Projects Fund. Those are for general capital improvements throughout the school district that they can actually have an actual levy in Fund 4, and that can be used for ongoing maintenance purposes or ongoing projects, minor projects. And also the Fund 4 is used to pay your lease debt, which you saw on the first page as well.
This may be a not great question, but can general obligation fund bonds only be used for like capital improvements? Like you can't, like when we take a bond out, we can't use that money for teacher salaries.
Exactly right. That's
Okay.
exactly right.
Okay.
The once you put that 50, whatever amount you put on the ballot, those can only be used for capital expenditures, capital projects.
All
It
right.
cannot
Thank
be
you.
used for teacher salaries or general operating needs.
And Jenny, we have sub-funds of each of those funds too, just to make things more complicated. And we track those bond proceeds in sub-funds so that we keep them completely segregated from the regular operating capital.
Okay. Yeah.
So maybe another way to ask that question is, can you remind us what is permissible to spend bond funds on?
There's I mean, whole host of things. You can spend bonds on roofs, HVAC, lighting, safety and security measures, asphalt, concrete, building renovations, building improvements, new buildings. You can use it on actually refinancing existing lease obligations. You can use it on your rolling fleet if you wanted to. So there are a whole host of things that you can use. Computers, and any type of capital expenditures. And people rarely use bond money for computers just because their average life is, 3 years or less. Mainly when you're looking at projects for your bond funds, you're looking at trying to finance, larger ticket items and ticket items that may have a useful life of over 8 to 10 years.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that reminder. Lorenzo, I have been around for a few of these issues, although not the 2010 one. So I'll be interested to hear the reminder on what that was spent on specifically. But this idea of having a no tax increase issue put to the voters that actually moves funding from the levy to the operating fund is a new concept to me and maybe to others. So could you just say a little bit more maybe about that concept generally, since you've now introduced it to as a specific possibility?
Yeah, and this is becoming more common, I would say probably in the last 10 years, where you've seen, and I'll say this includes, I know I'm talking to the Maplewood Richmond High School District, but this includes cities and fire districts where we've seen this happen, where obviously there's a need, the operating needs are a little bit higher. Then, because you have your costs associated with teacher salaries, benefits, and ongoing expenditures on the operating side. And as school districts, the need for capital expenditures decreases slightly. You'll see that because in the debt service fund, you're not handcuffed. And Chris can probably talk to you about Hancock. I can as well. But because the debt service fund is not handcuffed, any growth that you receive in that debt service fund, you actually achieve all of that growth. So what happens is your actual levy gets to a certain point to where if you don't have pressing capital expenditure needs, or if your buildings are in good shape, as you start to pay off debt, you certainly have more actual levy on the debt service side than what you actually need to pay your current obligations and possibly new obligations going forward. So what you'll see is a lot of school districts that have more pressing needs on the operating side. They'll use that opportunity to actually keep their existing levy the same, and then transfer some of that debt service levy to the operating. So you're not actually increasing the overall levy for the school district. You're actually shifting the funds from your Fund 3 to your Fund 1 or 2.
And I guess my question is, because of Hancock, it's interesting that you can do that. And so is there, I guess, just a specific law or rule that allows you to do that? There's just nothing preventing anyone from doing that, I guess. And how like, this is not a new concept. You're saying you've seen
Yeah.
other districts do this exact same thing.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, this is becoming a commonplace over the past 10 or so years, where
Okay.
districts are wanting to keep their overall levy the same because that's what taxpayers are seeing, but they have a real pressing need on the operating side.
Yeah.
And so this kind of allows you to actually keep your existing levy the same, and then transfer those funds to the operating side and get those necessary dollars, to whether it's using it for benefits, teacher salaries, or just ongoing, expenditures on the operating side. It's a useful tool without burdening the taxpayer more than what they already pay.
But again, to reiterate, a vote of the people is required in order.
Yes.
We can't just move it. We have to ask the people to do that.
Oh, exactly right. Great point.
And so I guess the simplest way for community to understand is that we are limited in what we can on our one rate, but we are not in our debt service. So we were able to take the full benefit of last year's very large increase in assessed value, which left us with a surplus, which allowed us to pay down some debt, have more room to borrow. And so and we need money for teacher salaries and things like that, so for community, it's that instead of lowering that rate, we're going to keep it the same. We already have it. And then we don't have to ask you to pay more in taxes. We're going to use what we have to shift it to that fund and use it for what we need it for. And so that's what the public will be deciding is, hey, can we use what we already have in a different space?
Exactly right. And what you see, this is just not the last 5 years. Going back to 2010, you'll see, look at your assessed valuation, you'll see that there's been, growth in more than 10% in several of those years. So because of that growth has allowed you to be able to put yourself in a position to do this.
Yeah, and previously, obviously, that was benefiting the needs in the buildings, right? Like we had the expansion needs at the ECC that benefited from increased borrowing capacity. And then obviously the really big project at the middle school, high school campus that we definitely couldn't have done 10 years ago because of the limitations on our borrowing capacity.
Exactly. And I did want to look at one thing really quick here.
So I guess another point is that we could do that and then have more funds in order to pay teacher and staff raises. But it would also allow us we still have enough capacity that we could also do a bond to pay for a lot of the remaining capital improvements, like the track, and like there's still some other outdated parts in our high school, I know, and things like that. So we could do both, and still we would not be asking the public for a tax increase in order to do that.
Exactly.
Okay.
And give furniture too, Jenny. I just want to
yes.
You said furniture?
Yes.
Then this next page is showing you actually this is pretty simple as well. But with the assessed valuation, transferring actual 50 cent to the from the debt service to the operating, it's going to generate roughly about $2.2 million in additional revenue for the school district. Obviously, with any assessed valuation growth, that number will change. But one thing I will tell you, once you transfer those funds over to funds 1 and 2, those will then be subject to Hancock. And so you're limited in terms of the amount of growth that you could receive based on the 3-pronged test of 5% CPI or actual assessed valuation growth.
Can you walk me through that again real quick? Where would we be running into that limit when we transfer the, say, 2.27 million over?
When you transfer that to the operating, so there's a
Yes.
rule in place. It's called the Hancock rule or the
Right.
Hancock Amendment, and
Yes,
so
yes.
that's where you would run into it. So whenever you have assessed valuation growth, you're capped at the most at 5% in terms of growth in revenue in any calendar year. So there's a three-pronged test that's kind of implemented.
Because this is
So
going to go to those funds, we have to make sure it doesn't raise it by more than one of those
5%.
three values. Yeah,
Yeah,
5% or the other two numbers, whichever is
exactly lesser.
lower.
You're exactly right.
Correct.
So
Correct.
if your CPI is 3%, then you have your 5% number in terms of the max. But if your assessed valuation growth is only 1.5%, you're limited to that 1.5% because that's the lesser of those three numbers.
And is the 50 cents on the dollar here, is that the I mean, this 2.27 million, is that what, have you calculated that because that would keep us within the three-prong test?
No, that's just transferring just simple 50 cent over. And then, in that number will be reevaluated actually each year when you go to set your levy, because at some point, if you get 10% growth, in one calendar year and CPI is 3%, and then you have your 5%, you're going to be limited to that 3% in terms of, so that 50 cent number may wind up being 48% because that's what 48 cent, because that's what's allowing you to get that 3% growth. So that number could change in future years.
Okay, got it.
So we can't predict then really with any certainty that we will get the full benefit of 2.274 million every year. And so I guess that would be a helpful, like if we're already at the limit.
Yeah.
How does that work?
So you'll get that 2.2 million.
Okay.
You'll get that, but you're going to be capped at just whatever the lesser. So you'll get I'll just say, for lack of a better term, you'll get some modest increase each year because it's allowing you to actually go up to the lesser of those three amounts. So if that three amount is 2%, you'll get a 2% raise. I'm just going to make it simplistic, a 2% raise on that number each year, should that's what your numbers come in at. So you will see some modest increases, but you won't see the same increases that you would receive should your assessed valuation go above, gets to be 10% growth, or that 5% number.
And how often do you have to go back to the taxpayers and ask them about these pivots, these shifts from Fund 3 to Fund 1 or 2?
So this will be a one-time shift. So you'll ask the taxpayers to shift this over from Fund 3 to Fund 1, and that'll be a one-time shift. And then at that point, it makes it permanent.
Oh, okay. So once they voted on it once, it's permanent. But we don't have to do it every year. We just can do it once they've permitted it.
Yes.
Okay. They've given us permission, but not necessarily have to do it.
Yeah, but if the school district's needs are, I don't know if that 2.2 million will be enough to satisfy where you need to be. So presumably the 50 cent would be used for the entire purpose.
Right. Well, yeah, thank you. This is not related necessarily to your presentation, but I'm just concerned that we would see this as a solution to some problems that could be fixed by some other financial restraints. But that's something that's a conversation for another day.
And Brian, we are working through those pieces, and that's one of the items that we plan to bring forth, which will impact as you see the fund balance grow or reduce. And so Chris and I are meeting almost daily, if not more, to discuss what those items are as we continue to package something to bring forward to the board.
Sure, thank you.
In timing wise, any sort of bond or levy or anything that needs to go on a ballot has to be done. We have to have that finalized by December. Is that accurate?
So you have to actually have that completed 10 weeks prior to the election. So that date that you have to submit that to St. Louis County all your ballot language that that is actually approved by the Board of Education prior to that, you have to have it to St. Louis County by January 28th of 2025. So presumably you would want to either, most issuers try to pass all that language before the winter break, so that it's kind of a clean slate, that they could kind of relax, and then approve it through the Board of Education at that meeting in December. And then that gives you a month to kind of get it over to St. Louis County in terms of before that January 28th deadline.
Okay, thank you.
I have another. Oh, go ahead, Trent. Then I have a question.
So if we move up 50 cents from the debt 3 fund to funds 1 and 2, we get 2.274 million, and we can do that once, and we get that 2.07 more million. Now that money can grow, but it can only grow subject to Hancock. So it can only grow solving the 3-prong test, right?
Right.
And then you said that it's permanent, meaning that if we ever wanted to move it back to the debt funds, that we could not do that.
Right. You have to if you want to move that back to the debt fund, you would have to actually go to the voters to move it back. It'll be another shift.
Okay.
So I have a question that's related to that. I mean, that was going to be part of my question. The other part is, have we never voted on this before? Has this never been something we've approached the voters with?
Not to my recollection. And I've worked with the school district since 1997, Brian.
And that's been permitted by Missouri law since that time, or is this more of a new thing?
Oh, no, that's been permitted.
Can I jump in to Brian, to your question? So this conversation, actually, when the board started asking administration to look at additional ways to fund revenue, these are some of the conversations that have been had with Lorenzo, as well as other districts that have actually done it. So it was part of the strategy based on the acts of the board.
You know, I guess I'm surprised we
Katie's,
didn't do this in the 90s.
Well, I think to Katie's point, it was that struggling to keep up infrastructure wise. So we did not have the capacity or the luxury to be able to do this type of transfer, because I think we were always sort of getting to our bond capacity with capital improvements is what I'm sort of understanding.
Well, and then too, go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry.
Our assessed values were so low that's really what the main limiting factor to
that's true too.
is that the assessed valuations didn't really start to balloon until, what was that, the 21?
Yeah, it's been the last few years. We've all
Yeah.
felt it. Yes.
And then I think probably in 2008, 2009, there was a balloon there as well. But then also another thing too, Brian, and this is showing my age, but as I get closer and closer to 60, I know I don't look it. I know I look probably 35. My wife reminds me all the time that I'm approaching 60. But when I first started doing this business, about 30 years ago, actually, the debt limit I think about 8 years later to 10%. And then it's just been at 15% for like the past 10 years or so. So the school district was always up against its debt limit, and now, and both those two changes actually went before the legislature in Jeff City to advocate for increasing that debt limit, because one thing that we did know is that school districts always need money. So if that debt limit is artificially low, is low, they're going to go the lease route, and lease route is more expensive. So you're basically forcing school districts to borrow at a more expensive rate by not increasing that debt limit. So we're having discussions. I'm talking to my lobbyists right now and developing a presentation to the finance committee for Jefferson City to look at increasing that limit from 15% to 20%.
Sure.
And then next page, Chris. And I believe, Chris, you wanted to take this page.
Absolutely. So this is in the same vein as what Lorenzo's been talking about. but I got a little bit more granular with the levy increases. So this represents what a 5-cent increase would represent in whole dollars at a 99.53% collection rate. So and the rightmost column is the difference between the two. So every 5 cents gets us about $227,500 roughly. So you can see here, someone spoke to what the need was. We can look at this chart here, and based on our current assessed valuation, we can predict what the additional tax revenue would be if we were to increase the levy by that amount of cents.
And this actual chart, just for as a reminder, was one of the requests that came out of the September Board Community Roundtable. The ask was what revenue would be generated and based on the increase in the levy. So it's just providing information as requested.
So put another way, this would be the cost to the taxpayers if we were to go out for a tax levy rather than transfer the money from the debt service fund to the operating fund. So this is that's the savings, is the 2.274 million or 2.75 million about.
Right.
Do we have any idea what the total value of all of our infrastructure is, all three buildings and the central office?
Like what our assessed valuations are, or what the
No,
I
just
think just each
I'm just
building.
trying to get an idea of how much money we would actually need if, we want to, replace a building, rebuild it, or refurnish, every, I don't know, 20 years or something. How much money do we really need to be able to borrow?
So it's a good question. So I think one of your questions was the actual value of your actual current buildings, facilities. I think Chris probably can give you that. But if you were probably looking to build a new elementary school, let's just say next year for, I'm just going to say 500 students, you're looking at probably right around 30 million. If you're looking at a middle school, that's probably right around, 50 million. And then a high school, for just a standalone high school that can accommodate 500 kids, you're probably talking right around 60 million as well.
Our buildings, the high school, I think was built in the 30s, so they stand the test of time, but they do need to be renovated extensively every once in a while.
I assume, and Dr. Jameson, will the facilities plan not only incorporate our current needs, but sort of trend out what we may need to replace down the line?
Correct. And so
Okay.
Chris and Mike actually met today with Navigate, and we were having conversations because with the initial audit that was actually completed, for example, when I shared that the older portion of the building is leaking water somewhere, I was like, that's something we want to make sure that we include. And so we talked about actually bringing someone in to give an additional assessment to see if there are other things that we're not considering. To your question, Trent, the item that Mike will bring forward will also show the cost to replace furniture as was requested. And I could have him to actually do that to show some forecasting for the other buildings if we wanted to do that, what the potential cost would be. So I did make a note of that. That was the last slide of the presentation. Are there any other questions? I did take as many notes as I could. Is there other information that you would like to see as we continue to have these conversations, not only with community, but with the board as well?
Well, first, I'd like to thank Lorenzo because this is not an easy topic to explain to people, and you did a fantastic job of keeping it very explainable. So I appreciate that very much. And then I guess I saw on the agenda next steps, and I guess that's just sort of my question is, will we have that sort of the materials we need to make an assessment at our board meeting in November?
So in November, you will have a draft of the assessment based on the work that Dr. Dietrich and Navigate have been completed. And then he's beginning the process to have the company to come in and identify a company to come in to do the thing that you asked around what are additional needs that we may need to anticipate. So we spent quite a bit of time today talking about that and the benefit, because that allows the board to be able to prioritize what the needs are versus not having all of the needs there in front of you. So with the actual cost, so that will come in November, and then you'll have another lag data point presented by Dr. Dietrich Navigate and some other folks as we continue to get that information in.
And Jenny, thanks for the compliments in terms of I try to make that information as easy as possible, easy to digest in terms of, you know, how it's put forth for you guys, so that, you know, you can make an informed decision as you kind of go along through this process.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Christy.
That concludes our.
Thanks. Okay, so if there are any more questions, I think we're ready to wrap it up. So can I get a motion to adjourn?
Motion
So
to
moved.
adjourn.
Okay, a second.
Second.
All right,
Second.
all in favor? Aye. All right.
Aye.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. Have a
Thank
great
you
rest of
so
your-
much.
You're welcome, and have a great rest of your evening. Take care.
Thank you. You too.
You too. Take
Bye.
care.